You ever feel like your life is stuck on repeat? Like you're living in a perfectly manicured prison of your own making? Well, meet Mildred. Prim, proper, and about to trade her starched blouses for a life of, well, let's just say it involves a fish, a very loud parrot, and a whole lot of laughs. And maybe a few tears. But will Mildred's grand escape lead to freedom? Or land her in a bigger cage than ever? Stick around to find out in this side-splitting story that proves sometimes the wildest adventures start with the most unexpected accomplices.
Chapter 1. The Great Escape. Mildred sniffed. The air in her meticulously organized linen closet, usually a haven of lavender and starched perfection, now reeked faintly of fish. It wasn't coming from the pristine stacks of towels, nor the neatly folded nightgowns. It was emanating from Mildred herself, the culprit, a strategically placed mackerel tucked under her starched white blouse. It was a desperate measure, born of even more desperate circumstances. Today was the day Mildred was escaping. Escaping what, exactly? Well, that depended on who you asked. To her dear nephew, Reginald, a stickler for propriety and punctuality, it was escaping her duties, a never-ending cycle of tea parties, embroidery circles, and charity functions. To Mildred, it was escaping a life that felt less like living and more like being meticulously filed away in a dusty drawer. The plan, meticulously crafted over weeks of stolen moments, was audacious, to say the least. It involved a borrowed top hat, a strategically placed feather boa — Reginald hated anything remotely flamboyant — and a carefully chosen escape route, the window overlooking the rarely used side garden. With a grimace, Mildred hoisted herself onto a precariously placed stack of gardening books, wincing as the fish threatened to become airborne. Heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, she wrestled the window open. The crisp morning air a welcome contrast to the stifling confines of the house. Just as she was about to heave herself out, a twig snapped beneath the window. Mildred froze. Had she been spotted? Her escape plan, already teetering on the edge of absurdity, was about to take a turn for the disastrous. Chapter 2. The Pigeon Whisperer. Mildred peeked out the window, heart hammering a frantic tattoo against her ribs. Below, a portly pigeon cocked its head, beady eyes fixed on the precariously balanced figure in the window. In its beak, glinting accusingly in the morning light, was the missing piece of Mildred's escape, the strategically placed mackerel. Despair threatened to engulf Mildred. Without the fish, Reginald wouldn't be distracted long enough for her to make a clean getaway. Yet, retrieving it meant descending past the watchful bird. Taking a deep breath, Mildred did the only thing she could think of. She extended her hand, palm open, towards the pigeon. To her utter astonishment, the pigeon hopped closer, cocking its head again. Tentatively, it extended a leg, placing it gingerly in Mildred's open palm. A surge of something akin to pride shot through Mildred. Perhaps escaping wasn't so outlandish after all, if she could make friends with a pigeon. The moment of triumph was short-lived. As Mildred reached for the fish, the pigeon fluttered its wings with unexpected force, sending her crashing back into the linen closet. A muffled yelp escaped her lips, quickly smothered by a sneeze, a result of the rogue feather boa now tickling her nose. The pigeon, emboldened by its apparent victory, strutted on the windowsill, triumphantly displaying the fish in its beak before taking flight. Mildred stared after it, a sense of utter defeat settling in her stomach. Not only was she still trapped, but she was also a fish short and covered in a cloud of fluffy pink feathers. This was not how Mildred envisioned her grand escape. Chapter 3. The Art of Inconspicuous Infiltration, featuring a particularly loud parrot. Defeated and dusted in feathers, Mildred surveyed the wreckage of her escape attempt. The window was firmly shut, the remaining feather boa draped limply across the gardening books like a deflated boa constrictor. The only consolation prize, a lingering fishy aroma that clung stubbornly to her blouse. Escape Plan A, it seemed, was a complete bust. Dejected, Mildred slumped onto a plush armchair, the kind Reginald favored for afternoon naps. As she contemplated her next move, a glint of gold caught her eye. Perched on a nearby stand, nestled amongst Reginald's prized collection of porcelain birds, was Bartholomew. Bartholomew wasn't your average porcelain bird. He was, in fact, a very much alive and rather disgruntled parrot, a gift from a well-meaning but misguided relative. Reginald, a man of refined tastes, loathed the squawking emerald menace. Mildred, on the other hand, had developed a begrudging fondness for the bird's flamboyant plumage and penchant for mischief. An idea, audacious even by Mildred's newfound standards, began to form in her mind. Bartholomew, with his piercing squawks and vibrant green feathers, was the perfect distraction. But how to get him out of the house, and more importantly, out of his gilded cage, without alerting Reginald? With a sly smile, Mildred rose from the armchair. This escape attempt, unlike the last, would require stealth, cunning, and perhaps a strategically placed biscuit. Chapter 4. The Pursuit of Pastries and the Perils of Parallel Parking. Mildred tiptoed down the grand staircase, her starched blouse still clinging faintly to the ghost of mackerel. Bartholomew's cage, thankfully unlocked, Reginald, bless his trusting soul, never suspected his feathered nemesis, was clutched precariously in her hand. The kitchen, usually a domain of bustling maids and the occasional grumpy cook, was deserted. Seizing the opportunity, Mildred made a beeline for the pastry pantry, a room Reginald rarely ventured into, fearing the temptation of sugary delights. Minutes later, she emerged, clutching a plate piled high with Reginald's favorite, delicate apricot turnovers. The plan was simple: lure Bartholomew out of his cage with the promise of pastry, then sneak him out a strategically chosen back door. Back in the living room, Mildred placed the plate on the table, a trail of crumbs leading to the open cage door. Bartholomew, initially skeptical, eyed the pastries with suspicion. Then, with a squawk that could shatter glass, he lunged, sending crumbs flying. Just as Mildred reached for the cage, a loud honking echoed from outside. Glancing out the window, her heart sank. Reginald, punctual as ever, was pulling into the driveway, his prized cherry-red sports car sputtering in protest as he attempted a particularly ambitious and ill-advised parallel parking maneuver. Mildred scrambled. Bartholomew, now hopped up on sugar and arrogance, squawked a war cry, feathers ruffled in defiance. There was no time for a graceful exit. With a sigh, Mildred grabbed the cage, Bartholomew clinging precariously to the top, and sprinted for the back door. She burst out just as Reginald, having finally wrestled his car into a semblance of order, slammed the front door shut. The sight that greeted him would forever be etched in his memory. His prim and proper aunt, a whirlwind of starched white and feathers, disappearing into the garden, pursued by a squawking emerald menace. Chapter 5. The Grand Undercover Operation, disrupted by a persistent pug. The rose bushes, usually Mildred's pride and joy, became a thorny obstacle course as she weaved through the garden, Bartholomew clinging on for dear life. Panting, she reached the back fence, a rickety wooden barrier separating her from freedom. Just as she was about to hoist herself over, a flash of white fur materialized at her feet. It was Winston, Mrs. Abernathy's prize-winning pug, a notorious busybody with a penchant for sniffing out trouble and occasionally discarded sausages. Winston, mistaking Mildred for a particularly active garden gnome, let out a series of indignant barks. Bartholomew, never one to back down from a challenge, puffed out his chest and squawked a retort. The ensuing cacophony shattered the morning tranquility. Mildred winced. Discretion, it seemed, had flown the coop along with a very disgruntled pigeon. There was no way she could scale the fence with Winston yapping at her heels and Bartholomew conducting a one-bird orchestra. Thinking fast, Mildred grabbed a nearby watering can and, with a deep breath, unleashed a jet of water at the startled pug. Winston, yelping in surprise, retreated with a disgruntled shake of his fur. Seizing the opportunity, Mildred hoisted herself over the fence, Bartholomew miraculously still perched on the cage. Landing with a thud on the other side, she surveyed the scene. Freedom stretched before her, a bustling street lined with shops and cafes. Just then, a glint of chrome caught her eye. It was Reginald's car, parked haphazardly at the curb, a trail of mangled roses marking its path. Mildred groaned. Her escape, while undeniably dramatic, had left a trail of destruction in its wake. Reginald, no doubt, was on the warpath. With a sigh, she plunged into the throng of people, Bartholomew's squawks now a beacon guiding her towards the unknown. Chapter 6. Mission. Accomplished, mostly, with a side of unexpected consequences. Mildred, her starched blouse now sporting a suspicious green stain courtesy of Bartholomew, found herself in a bustling bakery. The aroma of fresh bread and pastries was a welcome change from the stale air of Reginald's mansion. She slipped into a booth, Bartholomew's cage precariously balanced on the table. Exhausted but strangely exhilarated, she ordered a cup of tea and a slice of lemon cake. It was the first time she'd indulged in such a treat without fear of Reginald's disapproving glare. As she savored the sweet, tangy flavor, a familiar figure rounded the corner and entered the bakery. It was Reginald, his face a thundercloud, his hair ruffled, a testament to his earlier parking woes. He spotted Mildred immediately, then his gaze fell on Bartholomew, who squawked a greeting, crumbs clinging to his beak. Reginald's face contorted in a mixture of fury and amusement. Mildred, bracing herself for a tirade, was surprised by his next action. He sighed, a long, weary sigh, and slumped into the booth opposite her.
"Well, Mildred,"
he said, his voice surprisingly mild.
"it seems you've finally gotten some excitement in your life."
Mildred stared at him, speechless. Reginald, ever the pragmatist, continued,
"However, I must insist you return Bartholomew, and perhaps we could discuss a more conventional form of entertainment in the future."
A hesitant smile bloomed on Mildred's face. Perhaps, she thought, escape wasn't the answer. Maybe all she needed was a little adventure, a change of pace, and a nephew who, while uptight, wasn't entirely devoid of a sense of humor. As they exited the bakery, Reginald with a cage in hand and Mildred with a mischievous glint in her eye, they spotted a flyer for a local bird show. Mildred winked. Maybe a little unconventional entertainment wasn't such a bad idea after all. After all, who knew, Bartholomew might even win a prize.